At 72 years old, I found my name on a $680,000 loan, and the cosigner was my own daughter-in-law. I did not sign that paper. I did not see that paper. I did not even know that paper existed until a man from the bank called my house on a Tuesday morning and asked me if I was aware that my property was listed as collateral for a construction loan taken out 4 months earlier. I remember standing in my kitchen, holding the phone with one hand and holding the edge of my counter with the other, because my knees went soft under me, and I thought, this cannot be real. Somebody has made a mistake. Somebody has the wrong Iris Calloway. But there is only one Iris Calloway in this town, and that Iris Calloway was me, and the address on that loan was my address. The house my husband built with his own hands 41 years ago. The house I raised my son in. The house I planned to die in with dignity and peace. That peace ended the moment the banker read my social security number back to me and asked me to confirm it. My name is Iris Calloway. I am 72 years old, and until 4 months ago, I believed my family loved me the way I loved them, without conditions, without calculation, without a price tag hidden underneath the hugs. I have one son, Sherman, 44 years old, married to a woman named Renee, and together they gave me 2 grandchildren, Garrett, who is 16, and Bailey, who is 12. I want you to understand something before I go any further into this story, because what I am about to tell you is not some tale I am spinning for entertainment. This happened to me. This is happening to families all over this country right now, quietly, behind closed doors, while grandmothers like me smile at Sunday dinner and have no idea that their entire life savings, their home, their name, their credit, their dignity, is being used as a tool by people who are supposed to protect them. The banker's name was Mr. Alvarez, and I remember he had a kind voice, apologetic almost, the voice of a man, who deals in bad news for a living, and has learned to soften the blow without softening the facts. He told me the loan had entered its second missed payment cycle, and that as part of standard procedure, the bank was required to reach out to every guarantor listed on the account to confirm awareness of the current status. He said the word guarantor slowly, carefully, the way you might explain a diagnosis to someone you suspect has never heard the word before. And when I asked him to explain exactly what that meant for me personally, he told me that as a secondary guarantor with real property listed as collateral, my house could ultimately be subject to a lien, and if the default continued without resolution, foreclosure proceedings, though he was quick to add that this was typically a last resort process that took time and offered multiple opportunities for resolution before it ever reached that point. Multiple opportunities for resolution. I remember turning that phrase over in my mind after we hung up, thinking about how strange it was to hear something so clinical applied to the possible loss of the only home I had ever truly belonged to. I thought about my husband's hands on that lumber, the particular way he used to hum while he worked, off-key, cheerful, completely unaware that 41 years later, stranger with a kind voice would be using words like lien and foreclosure in connection with the walls he built around our life together. I did not raise my voice on that phone call. I have never been a woman who raises her voice. My mother taught me that a raised voice is a sign you have already lost the argument in your own head. So I kept my voice low and steady, and I asked the man from the bank to send me every single document with my name on it. He said he would email it, and I told him I do not do email. Send it by mail, certified, signature required. He said that would take 3 to 5 business days. I told him I had already waited 4 months without knowing, so 3 to 5 more days would not kill me. Though at that moment, I genuinely was not sure. After I hung up the phone, I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Sherman used to do his homework, the same table where I taught Garrett how to shuffle a deck of cards, and I stared at the wall for a long time. I want to be honest with you. My first feeling was not anger. My first feeling was confusion, because I could not make the pieces fit. Why would my name be on a loan for $680,000? I do not run a business. I do not own rental properties. I live on a modest pension, and my husband's life insurance, invested carefully, spent carelessly on nothing but groceries and church donations and birthday gifts for my grandchildren. There was no version of my life that included borrowing that kind of money. And there was certainly no version of my life where I would sign my name to something without reading every single word twice. I want to tell you a little about who I was before that phone call, because it matters for understanding how deep this cut went. I was not a fragile old woman, sitting alone in a dusty house waiting for someone to visit me out of pity. I still drove myself to the grocery store every Wednesday morning before the crowds came in. I still balanced my own checkbook by hand, out of habit, even though the bank did it automatically now. I volunteered at my church 3 days a week, organizing the food pantry, a job I had held for 11 years. And the women there would tell you, Iris Calloway does not miss a detail. Not in the inventory, not in the donation log, not in anything. I tell you this not to boast, but because it makes what happened to me even harder to swallow. A woman who tracked every canned good in a church basement to the exact number had, somehow, through nothing but love and trust, let $680,000 of debt attach itself to her name, without noticing until a stranger on the phone told her so. I thought about my husband in those first few minutes after the call, more than I thought about Sherman or Renee. I thought about the day he brought home the deed to this land, so proud. A young man who had grown up with nothing, standing in an empty field telling me this is where we are going to build our life. Iris, right here, and nobody is ever going to take it from us. He said that to me 41 years ago, and he believed it with his whole chest. And I had believed it too, right up until the moment a banker's voice on the phone made it clear that the promise he made me was now sitting on a countdown clock controlled by people who had never once dug a foundation with their own hands or understood what that land actually meant. Then I remembered something, and my stomach dropped so fast I had to put my hand flat on the table to steady myself. 4 months ago, in the spring, Renee had come to visit me alone, without Sherman, without the children, which was unusual because Renee rarely came without an audience. She brought me a bouquet of tulips, my favorite, and she sat with me at this very table and told me she needed my help with something important for the family. She said Sherman was expanding his contracting business, that he had a chance to buy a commercial property downtown, an old warehouse he wanted to convert into an event space, and that the bank needed additional paperwork from family members as a formality. Something about verifying family financial history for a small business loan. She had a folder with her, thick, official looking, and she flipped through it quickly, showing me highlighted sections, telling me these were just verification forms, nothing binding, just proof that family supported the business. I remember signing something that day. I remember it because my hand was shaking slightly, not from fear, but because my arthritis was bad that morning. And Renee held the folder steady for me while I signed on the lines she pointed to. 3 or 4 pages, moving quickly because she said she had somewhere to be. She thanked me, kissed my cheek, told me I was saving the family, and left with the folder tucked under her arm before I could even ask for a copy. I did not ask for a copy because I trusted her. I trusted my daughter-in-law, the way you trust someone who has sat at your table for 12 years, who calls you mom on Christmas cards, who cried real tears at my husband's funeral 8 years ago, and held my hand through the whole service. 4 months later, a banker was reading my social security number back to me over the phone. I did not confront anyone that day. I want you to understand why. In my 72 years on this earth, I have learned that the moment you show your hand out of panic, you lose the game before you even understand what game you are playing. My mother used to say, "A smart woman gathers her facts before she gathers her family." And that is exactly what I intended to do. So I waited for the mail. 3 days later, an envelope arrived, thick, certified, and I signed for it with a hand that had gone completely calm, because by then the shock had turned into something colder and much more useful. Inside that envelope was everything. The original loan application, $680,000. Taken out in the name of a business called Calloway Premier Builds LLC, a name I had never heard of, though it used a slight misspelling of my own family name that made my chest tighten. Sherman was listed as the primary borrower. Renee was listed as co-signer and guarantor. and I was listed as a secondary guarantor with my house. My paid-off house, the only asset I owned outright in this world, pledged as collateral. There was my signature on page after page, on lines I recognized from that afternoon with the tulips. Except now, reading the actual language above those lines instead of trusting Renee's rushed pointing finger, I understood exactly what I had been tricked into signing. I had not verified family financial history. I had pledged my home as collateral against a loan for a warehouse conversion project that, according to the documents, had already missed 2 payments. 2 missed payments, which meant the bank was circling, which meant if a 3rd payment was missed, the bank had every legal right to come after the collateral, which was my house, the house my husband built, the house that was supposed to be the one thing in this world nobody could ever take from me. I sat with those papers for 3 hours. I did not cry, though I want to be honest, part of me wanted to. I have cried plenty in my life, at my husband's funeral, at both my parents' funerals, at the births of my grandchildren, and there is no shame in a woman's tears, but this was not a moment for tears. This was a moment for arithmetic, and I have always been good with numbers. Better than Sherman ever gave me credit for. I had spent 30 years as a bookkeeper before I retired, and if there is one thing 30 years of bookkeeping teaches you, it is how to read a document for what it actually says, not for what someone tells you it says. I called my nephew that evening, my late husband's sister's boy, a lawyer 2 towns over named Thomas, a serious young man who had always had a soft spot for me because I used to slip him $20 bills at family reunions when he was in law school and broke. I told him everything calmly in order, the way I would have laid out a set of financial statements. He was quiet for a long moment after I finished, and then he said something I will never forget. He said, "Aunt Iris, what you are describing is not a family favor gone wrong. What you are describing is elder financial fraud, and depending on how the paperwork was presented to you, possibly forgery and possibly a felony." I asked him what I should do, and he said the first thing I needed to do was nothing at all. Not yet. He said the worst thing I could do was call Sherman and Renee and confront them, because the moment they knew I had figured it out, they would have time to cover their tracks, to move money, to alter records, to build a story before I had the ammunition to counter it. He told me to let him pull the full loan file through legal channels, to check the notary stamp on my signature pages, because he suspected, given the timeline and given how quickly Renee had left with the folder that day, that the notarization might not have been done properly, if at all. While Thomas worked through the official channels, I did some quiet work of my own, the kind of work a bookkeeper's instincts never fully retire from. I began going back through my own bank statements from the past year, month by month, looking for anything unusual, small withdrawals I might have overlooked, and I found 2 charges I did not recognize, modest ones, $40 here, $60 there, listed under a vague merchant name I did not know. When I mentioned this to Thomas, he told me these were likely small test transactions, the kind fraudsters sometimes use to verify that an account or a card is active and unmonitored before attempting something larger. It chilled me to think that someone had been testing the waters on my own account separately from the loan itself, and Thomas agreed we needed to freeze every card and account. I held and reissue everything under new numbers immediately, which we did within 48 hours. I also called my old friend Dolores, a woman I have known since our children were in grade school together, whose late husband worked at the very bank branch this loan had come through. Retired now, but still friendly with several people on staff there. I did not ask her to do anything improper, and I want to be clear about that, because I would never put a friend in a compromising position. I simply asked her, over coffee, in the most general terms, whether she had heard anything about how that branch handled notarizations for large loans, whether corners ever got cut when a loan officer was under pressure to close deals quickly. Dolores told me, without naming names, that there had been whispers for over a year about one particular young loan officer pushing deals through faster than the paperwork should have reasonably allowed, and that a young notary on staff had been reprimanded once already for sloppy record keeping. though nothing had ever been formally investigated. That loan officer, it turned out later through Thomas's official inquiry, was the same person who had approved Sherman and Renee's original application, a man named Curtis Beaumont, who resigned from the bank abruptly 2 weeks after the fraud investigation into Ashley Prentice's notary journal began, before anyone could formally question him about how closely he had reviewed the collateral documents before pushing the loan through. He was right. It took him 11 days, but he found it. The notary stamp on my pages was registered to a notary public who worked at the same bank branch that issued the loan, a young woman named Ashley Prentice. And when Thomas quietly requested her notary journal records through a formal channel, there was no entry for my name on the date in question. No entry at all, which meant my signature had been notarized fraudulently, stamped as witnessed and verified when no such witnessing had ever occurred. Which meant, according to Thomas, that this was not simply a case of me being confused about paperwork. This was a coordinated act. Someone had either forged the notarization or paid someone to fake it. And either way, it meant Renee had not just misled me that day at my kitchen table. She had committed a crime, and she had used the tulips and the kiss on my cheek to make sure I never looked closely enough to catch her doing it. While Thomas was still building the case, quietly in the background, something happened that told me Renee suspected I was on to her, even before I ever said a word. Sherman called me one evening, sounding strange, careful in a way he never usually was with me. And he asked, almost too casually, whether I had been talking to a lawyer about anything. I told him truthfully that I occasionally spoke to Thomas about small estate matters, which was not a lie, only an incomplete answer. And I asked him why he wanted to know. He hesitated, then admitted that Renee had mentioned, offhand, that I seemed distant lately, that she wondered if my memory was starting to slip, if perhaps I was getting confused about paperwork I had signed months ago, and whether the family should think about looking into some kind of support for me going forward. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long moment after that call ended, because I understood immediately what she was doing. She was laying groundwork, quietly, carefully, to discredit me in advance, to plant the idea in Sherman's mind that if his mother ever raised concerns about a loan or a signature, it should be understood as the early confusion of an aging woman rather than the accurate observation of a woman who had spent 30 years reading financial documents for a living. It was, in its own way, one of the cruelest parts of the entire ordeal, crueler almost than the forgery itself, because it meant she was prepared to sacrifice not just my house, but my credibility, my dignity, my very sense of being trusted as a competent adult, in order to protect herself. I did not confront Sherman about it that night. I simply thanked him for checking on me, told him my mind was as sharp as it had ever been, and hung up the phone with a resolve that had, if anything, hardened even further. If Renee wanted to fight dirty by suggesting I was losing my faculties, then I intended to make absolutely certain that when the truth came out, it would come out with such overwhelming, undeniable documentation that no one in this family would ever again be able to question whether Iris Calloway understood exactly what she was looking at. I want to pause here and tell you something, because I know some of you watching this are grandmothers too, or mothers or fathers. People who have given everything to their children and never once expected anything back except love. When Thomas told me about the notary fraud, something inside me changed. It was not rage, not the kind you see in movies where a person screams and throws things. It was quieter than that, and in some ways much more dangerous. It was the feeling of a door closing on the version of myself that gave people the benefit of the doubt, and a new door opening on a version of myself that had absolutely nothing left to lose in this fight because the people who were supposed to protect me had already taken. The one thing I could not survive losing twice. My husband built that house for me in 1985, with lumber he chose by hand and floors he laid himself over a summer. He took off work just so it would be perfect before our first winter in it. I was not going to let my son and his wife hand it to a bank because they could not manage a warehouse project responsibly, and I was certainly not going to let them do it through fraud and then expect me to smile at Thanksgiving. Before I tell you what I did next, I want to hear from you for a moment, because this next part of the story gets very intense, and I think it matters where you are all watching this from tonight. So many of you write to me from all over the place, and I love reading it. It makes this feel less like I'm just talking into a camera and more like I am sitting across the table from real people who understand what it feels like to be underestimated by your own family. So before I continue, tell me in the comments what city you are watching from tonight. I read every single one of them. And if you have a grandmother in your life who has ever been taken advantage of, or if you are a grandmother yourself who has lived through something like this, let me know that too. All right, let us continue because it only gets more intense from here. Thomas advised me to move carefully and legally, and I agreed, but careful did not mean passive. The first thing I did was open a new bank account in a bank. Sherman and Renee had never used one 3 towns away, and I quietly began redirecting my pension deposits there. I did not close my old accounts immediately because Thomas said sudden movements might tip them off, but I made sure that whatever they were assuming they might someday have access to through me was slowly draining into a place they could not reach. Then I asked Thomas to help me file, through the proper legal channel, a formal dispute with the bank regarding the fraudulent notarization, demanding my name and my home be removed as collateral from the loan immediately, with documentation proving the notary fraud attached. Banks do not like fraud exposure. Banks like lawsuits and public exposure even less. Within 2 weeks of that filing, the bank's legal department contacted Thomas directly, not me, and began the process of releasing my house from the loan entirely, while opening their own internal investigation into the notary, Ashley Prentice, who I later learned lost her job and her notary license over what she had done. But removing my house from the loan did not remove Sherman and Renee's $680,000 problem. It only removed me from being the one who would pay for it, and here is where the story turns. Because up until this point, I had been playing defense, protecting myself, protecting my home. What happened next was not defense. What happened next, I will admit freely to you, was something closer to reckoning. I invited Sherman and Renee to Sunday dinner. I made a roast, the same recipe I have made every Sunday for 30 years. And I set the table with my good dishes, the ones from my wedding, and I told them over the phone that I wanted to talk about something important regarding the business, using almost the exact same casual, warm tone Renee had used with me 4 months earlier over the tulips. They came. Of course they came. Renee even brought me a bottle of wine, smiling at me the entire evening, laughing at Sherman's jokes, asking Bailey about her school project, playing the role of a woman who had done absolutely nothing wrong to a 72-year-old grandmother who trusted her completely. I let dinner finish. I let dessert finish. I sent Garrett and Bailey into the living room to watch television, told them Grandma needed to talk business with their parents, and once the children were out of earshot, I placed a manila folder on the table between us, the same kind of folder Renee had brought to my house that spring. Thick, official-looking, closed. I asked Renee to open it. Before she did, I want to tell you what that room felt like, because I have replayed it in my mind more times than I can count. The kitchen smelled like the roast still cooling on the stove. Bailey's cartoon was playing faintly from the living room down the hall, some cheerful theme song, completely unaware of what was happening 20 feet away. Sherman had his hand resting on the back of Renee's chair, an old habit of comfort between them, and I remember thinking, this is the last ordinary moment this family is going to have for a while, and I am the one about to end it, and I have to be strong enough to see it through, even though some old, soft part of me still wanted to fold the papers back up and pretend I had never opened that envelope from the bank at all. But I thought of my husband's floors under my feet, and I thought of the 11 days Thomas spent finding the truth, and I did not fold. She laughed at first, asked what kind of joke this was, But something in my face must have told her this was no joke, because her smile faded fast when she saw the first page, a copy of the loan document with my signature on it, and it faded even further when she saw the second page, the notary journal record showing no entry for my name on that date. And by the time she reached the third page, a formal letter from the bank's legal department confirming the fraud investigation into their own notary. Her hands were shaking so badly the papers rattled. Sherman looked at his wife, then at me, then at the papers, and I watched my son's face go through something I had never seen on it before, a mixture of confusion turning into horror, turning into a slow, sick understanding of what his wife had done, not just to me but possibly to him, because if Renee had forged notarization on my signature, there was no telling what else. She might have forged or misrepresented to secure that loan in the first place, including things Sherman himself may not have fully known about. I told them, in the same calm bookkeeper's voice I have used my entire life, that I had already had my name legally removed from the loan and my house released as collateral, that the bank's own investigation into their notary was already underway, and that I had copies of everything, filed with my lawyer, dated, notarized properly this time, should anything unfortunate happen to these documents in the future. I told Renee that I knew exactly what she had done that spring afternoon with the tulips, that I remembered every detail of that visit now with painful clarity, and that the only reason I had not already gone to the police to file a formal fraud complaint against her personally was that I wanted to give her one single chance, sitting right here at this table, to explain herself, to tell the truth, before I decided what happened next. The room was so quiet in that moment that I could hear the refrigerator humming, behind me and Bailey's cartoon still playing faintly, down the hall, life going on in one part of the house while it fell apart in another. Renee cried. I want to tell you that I felt nothing when she cried, because that would make me sound stronger than I actually was in that moment. But the truth is, some old part of me, the part that had loved her for 12 years, still ached watching her fall apart at my table. But I did not let that ache change my face or my voice. I sat there, arms folded, and I waited. The truth came out in pieces, ugly pieces. The warehouse project had been failing for over a year, hemorrhaging money faster than Sherman's contracting business could cover. And rather than tell anyone, Renee had spent months quietly juggling personal loans, credit cards, and finally, when the numbers became impossible, my name and my home. She told us the whole scheme had started small, almost accidentally, a single missed subcontractor payment. She thought she could quietly cover with a personal credit card before anyone noticed, and how one small cover-up had led to another, each one slightly larger and slightly more desperate than the last, until the only remaining option in her mind, the night she decided to bring that folder to my kitchen table, was to borrow against the one name in the family with a credit history, clean enough and a heart, trusting enough to make it possible. She admitted she had chosen the notary, specifically because the woman was a friend of a friend who owed her a favor from something unrelated, someone she thought would simply stamp the pages without asking questions, and that when the woman refused to falsify an actual notarization, Renee had stamped the pages herself using a stamp she had, in her words, borrowed from the bank office during a visit, an act which, Thomas later confirmed, elevated the entire situation from mere document fraud into felony forgery of a government seal. Renee said something else that night, quieter, almost to herself, that I did not fully understand until much later. She said she had told herself the whole time that it was not really stealing, because she fully intended to pay it all back once the warehouse project turned profitable, that in her mind it was borrowing rather than fraud, a temporary arrangement that only her own bad luck with contractors and permits and delayed timelines had turned into something worse than she ever planned. I told her, as gently as I could manage in that moment, that this is exactly what every person who has ever stolen from someone they love tells themselves in the beginning. That intention does not undo a signature forged with a stolen stamp. and that the road to real consequences is paved with people who meant to pay it back eventually. Sherman did not defend her. I want you to understand what that moment meant to me, because for one terrible second, I thought my own son might choose his marriage over his mother, the way sons sometimes do, out of some misguided loyalty or fear of being alone. But Sherman put his head in his hands and said, very quietly, that he had asked her multiple times over the past year where certain funds were coming from, and she had told him not to worry about it, that she was handling the business side. And he admitted shamefully that he had not pushed hard enough to know the truth because things were tense enough between them already and he did not want another fight. He looked at me and said, "Mom, I did not know it was your name. I swear to you, I did not know it was your name until right now." I believed him, not because I am naive, but because 30 years of reading financial documents teaches you to read faces too. And Sherman's face that night was not the face of a man performing innocence. It was the face of a man realizing in real time exactly how much damage had been done to the person who raised him, by the person he had chosen to build a life with. Sherman got up from the table at one point and walked to the window, his back to both of us, and he stood there for a long moment in silence while Renee cried quietly behind him, and I sat with my hands folded, waiting. When he finally turned around, his eyes were red, and he said something to Renee that I believe was the true turning point of that entire evening, more than anything I had said myself. He asked her how she could sit at his mother's table, eat her mother's cooking, let her mother hold her hand at his own father's funeral, and still decide that her home was an acceptable thing to gamble against a failing business, without ever once telling either of them the truth. Renee did not have an answer for that. She simply put her head down on the table and sobbed, and Sherman did not go to comfort her, which told me everything I needed to know about where his heart already stood, even before either of us had said the word separation out loud. I remember feeling, in that exact moment, a strange kind of grief that had nothing to do with money or houses at all. I was watching my son's marriage end in real time at my own kitchen table, a marriage I had genuinely hoped would last, that had given me 2 grandchildren I loved beyond measure. And even as I sat there holding the very evidence that had caused its collapse, some part of me mourned what was being lost alongside what was, undeniably being rightfully exposed. I told them both what would happen next, and I had decided this carefully, with Thomas's guidance. In the days leading up to that dinner, I was not going to destroy Renee's life out of pure vengeance, because I am not that kind of woman, and because Garrett and Bailey needed their mother in their lives regardless of what she had done to their grandmother. But I was also not going to pretend this had not happened, because a woman who commits felony forgery against a 72-year-old grandmother needs consequences, severe enough to actually mean something, or the lesson never lands and the pattern never breaks. I told Renee that she had exactly one option to avoid a formal criminal complaint being filed against her by both myself and, I suspected, the bank's own investigators once they finished tracing the stamp misuse. That option was full and complete transparency, immediately with Sherman, with the bank, and with a court-appointed financial mediator that Thomas would arrange, regarding every single dollar that had moved through that business over the past year. Every account, every loan, every hidden debt. I told her that Sherman deserved to know the true financial state of his own marriage and his own business before he sank. One more dollar or one more year of his life into a structure built on lies, and that if she refused this transparency, I would personally walk into the police station the following morning with Thomas at my side and file the complaint myself. She agreed. Of course she agreed, because the alternative was a felony record and very likely time behind bars. And whatever else Renee was, she was not stupid enough to choose prison over confession. The formal side of the restitution was handled separately through the bank's own recovery process once the notary fraud was confirmed by the state banking regulators, and Renee ultimately appeared before a judge in a restitution hearing that Thomas attended on my behalf, since I chose not to be present in the courtroom itself. I did not need to see her stand there, I had already seen her face at my kitchen table, which was, in its own way, a harder courtroom than any judge's chambers could have offered. The judge ordered a structured restitution plan tied to the bank's losses from the notary misuse specifically, garnished gradually from Renee's wages once she found steady work again, along with a formal record noting the forged notarization, which followed her for the mandatory period required by the state, showing up on background checks for employment in any position, handling financial documents, or holding any kind of fiduciary responsibility. Thomas told me it was not a light punishment, even without formal criminal charges pressed by me directly, because the combination of the bank's own regulatory penalty and the restitution order meant Renee would spend years digging out from under a financial and professional shadow entirely of her own making. What came out over the following weeks, once the full financial mediation began, was worse than even I had expected. The warehouse project was not simply behind on payments. It was functionally dead, unsellable in its current unfinished state, worth perhaps a third of what was owed on it. There were 2 other, smaller loans Renee had taken out using Sherman's business credit without his full knowledge, both maxed out, both delinquent. There was a personal credit line Renee had opened in her own maiden name. Slocum, 6 months before any of this began, nearly $40,000 drawn down, spent, according to the records Thomas obtained, on things that had nothing to do with any business at all. A car for her sister, an extended vacation Sherman had believed was a work trip for suppliers, jewelry purchases Renee later claimed were investments that she never actually invested. The full picture that emerged was not a woman making one desperate mistake under financial pressure. It was a woman who had, for well over a year, been quietly, systematically siphoning money and credit and trust from everyone around her, including her own husband. And when the walls finally started closing in, she had reached for the one source of untouched, trusting credit left in the family, me. The financial mediation Thomas arranged took place over 6 long sessions in a small conference room, above a coffee shop downtown, a neutral space chosen specifically because Thomas said people tell the truth more easily when they are not sitting in a courthouse or a bank office, surrounded by intimidating furniture. I attended 2 of those sessions myself at Sherman's request because he said he wanted a witness he trusted completely to help him understand the numbers, since by that point his confidence in reading his own business's finances had been badly shaken. I sat quietly in the corner with my reading glasses and a legal pad, the same way I used to sit in on budget meetings decades ago, and I watched page by page as the true shape of the debt revealed itself, larger and uglier with every session, until what had started as a story about one loan and one house had become a story about an entire year of quiet financial unraveling that Sherman had been almost completely blind to. There was a moment in the 4th session I will never forget. The mediator, a calm, unflappable woman named Diane who had clearly seen every version of this kind of ruin before, laid out a full accounting spreadsheet on the table, color-coded, and asked Renee to walk through each entry one at a time and explain its origin. Renee got through the first dozen entries steadily enough. Business expenses, materials, permits, the ordinary bones of a failing project. But when she reached an entry for nearly $6,000, labeled only as personal, dated during a week, Sherman remembered clearly because it was the week his own father, my husband, would have turned 70 had he lived. Renee's voice cracked for the first time in the entire process, and she admitted it had gone toward a private detox program for her younger brother, a secret she had kept from everyone in the family for over a year, because she was ashamed and did not know how else to pay for it without anyone asking questions. It was, I will admit, the first moment in this entire ordeal where I felt something other than anger toward her, a small, complicated stirring of understanding for a woman drowning in problems on every side of her life at once, trying to hold all of it together with debt and lies because she had never learned any other way to ask for help. Sherman filed for a legal separation 4 weeks after that dinner. I did not push him toward that decision, and I want to be clear about that because this is not a story about a mother-in-law engineering a divorce out of spite. I told him repeatedly during those weeks that his marriage was his own to save or end, that Renee's crime against me did not obligate him to leave her, that people can survive terrible mistakes if there is enough honesty and enough will on both sides to rebuild. But Sherman told me something that broke my heart and mended it at the same time. He said, "Mom, this was not the first lie. It was just the first lie big enough that I could no longer pretend I hadn't noticed all the smaller ones." He said watching what she did to me, his own mother, the woman who had never once in 12 years said an unkind word about Renee even when she probably deserved it, was the thing that finally showed him what he had been avoiding seeing about his marriage for years. Garrett found out most of the truth on his own, before anyone in the family had planned to tell him. He is 16, old enough to read a room, and he told me later that he had overheard part of a phone call between his father and Thomas one evening and pieced together enough to go looking for answers himself. He came to my house alone one Saturday afternoon on his bicycle, 16 years old and trying so hard to look calm, and he sat across from me at the same kitchen table where all of this had unfolded and asked me directly whether his mother had stolen from me. I did not lie to him. I have never believed in lying to children about hard truths, only in choosing carefully how much of the truth a particular child is ready to carry. I told him yes, that his mother had made serious mistakes, that those mistakes had real consequences, but that his mother loved him and his sister very much, and that grown-ups sometimes make terrible choices under pressure that have nothing to do with how much they love their children. Garrett cried that afternoon, the first time I had seen him cry since he was much younger, and he asked me if I hated his mother. I told him I did not hate her. That hatred was too heavy a thing to carry at my age, but that I had drawn boundaries with her that were going to stay in place for a long time, and that boundaries were not the same thing as hatred. They were simply how grown-ups protected themselves while still allowing room for people to change. Bailey, being younger, understood less of the detail and more of the feeling, the way 12-year-olds often do. She noticed her parents were sleeping in different rooms before anyone explained why, and she noticed Grandma Iris seemed tired and quiet at dinners for a while, and one evening she simply crawled into my lap the way she used to, when she was much smaller, and asked if everyone was going to be okay. I told her yes, because at my age you learn that children need the emotional truth even more than they need the factual truth. And the emotional truth was that yes, we were all going to be okay, even if okay looked different than it had 6 months earlier. I will tell you honestly, there were nights during that period when I lay awake in my house, the house that had almost been taken from me, and I felt a kind of satisfaction that I am not entirely proud of, watching the consequences unfold exactly as they should have. The bank pursued Renee for the stamp misuse separately from the loan default, and while I ultimately did not press a personal criminal complaint against her, largely for the sake of Garrett and Bailey, weighing what full destruction would cost my grandchildren against what a firmer, narrower kind of justice might preserve for their future, the bank's own investigation resulted in restitution, orders, and a permanent mark on her financial record that made her essentially unbankable for the foreseeable future, unable to take out so much as a car loan without a co-signer of her own, which I found to be a particular kind of justice, given how she had once used me the exact same way. But I want to tell you about the part of this story that surprised even me, because a story like this could easily end with me as simply the wronged grandmother who watched her family burn to the ground and felt vindicated. That is not how it ended, and I think that is the more important part of what I have to tell you tonight. About 2 months after the separation, Renee came to my house alone unannounced, on a rainy Thursday evening. I almost did not open the door. Part of me wanted to let her stand there in the rain and feel even a fraction of what I had felt sitting at my kitchen table with that phone in my hand. But I opened the door, because whatever else had happened, I had known this woman for 12 years, and some habits of decency do not simply disappear because a person has wronged you. She did not come to ask for money. She did not come to ask for forgiveness in some grand dramatic way either. She came, she told me, sitting in my kitchen with tea, I made out of pure muscle memory more than hospitality, because she needed to tell someone the truth about why she had done what she did. And she said she owed that truth to me more than to anyone else, because I was the one she had hurt the most while deserving it the least. She told me about her own mother, a woman I had met only a handful of times over the years at holiday gatherings, always pleasant, always well-dressed, always seemingly fine. Renee told me that her mother had lost everything in her early 40s, a business failure, a divorce, a slow spiral into debt that the family had hidden from everyone, including Renee, until collectors were calling the house daily and there was almost nothing left. Renee told me she had grown up watching her mother smile through Thanksgiving dinners while creditors circled, watching her mother borrow from anyone who would lend. Family, friends, coworkers, anyone, always with a story, always with a plan that never quite worked out. And Renee said that somewhere along the way, without ever consciously deciding to, she had absorbed the belief that this was simply what desperate people did to survive, that you borrowed against whoever trusted you most. Because the people who trusted you most were the ones least likely to say no. I'm not going to sit here and tell you this excused what she did to me. It did not, and I told her so directly, sitting at that table, that a difficult childhood explains a pattern. It does not forgive a felony, and she needed to hear that, plainly from me rather than have me pretend her confession erased the fraud. But I will tell you that hearing it changed something in how I carried the anger, because anger aimed at a stranger who simply decided to exploit you is a different weight than anger aimed at someone broken, enough to repeat. The only survival pattern she ever learned. It did not make me trust her again. Trust, once burned to the ground the way ours had been, does not simply regrow because someone finally tells the truth. But it made room, slowly, carefully, for something other than pure coldness. I told Renee that night that I forgave her, and I want to explain exactly what I meant by that, because forgiveness in a story like this is often misunderstood as forgetting, or as inviting someone back into your life exactly as they were before. That is not what I offered her. I told her I forgave her in the sense that I released myself from carrying hatred toward her for the rest of my life. Because hatred is a heavy thing to drag around at 72 years old, and I had already given this woman enough of my remaining years without giving her my peace of mind as well. But I told her forgiveness did not mean access. It did not mean she would ever again be handed a folder of papers to sign without reading every single word 3 times over. It did not mean Sunday dinners would go back to what they were. It meant simply that I would not spend what time I have left plotting further ruin against a woman who had already lost her marriage, her financial standing, and very nearly her relationship with her own children over this. Garrett and Bailey still live with Sherman primarily, though Renee sees them regularly, supervised at first through the separation agreement given the severity of what had happened, and gradually, over the following year, unsupervised again as she rebuilt something resembling stability, working 2 jobs, slowly paying down what could be paid down, attending financial counseling that Thomas, of all people, had actually recommended to her, because even my nephew, the lawyer, the man who had every legal right to want her buried, told me once that the goal of justice should be correction, not annihilation, especially when children are watching how the adults around them handle being wronged. I want to tell you about one particular Sunday dinner, almost a year after that first terrible confrontation, because it captures better than anything else how far this family had traveled by then. Sherman arrived early to help me set the table, something he had never once done in his adult life before all of this happened. And he brought with him a small folder of his own, which made my heart skip for just a second out of old. Learned fear before I saw what was actually inside it. It was not a loan document. It was a simple 1-page summary he had put together himself, in his own handwriting, of his business's current finances. Income, expenses, savings, nothing hidden, nothing rounded up or down to look better than it was. He set it on the table in front of me and said, "Mom, I want you to always know exactly where things stand with me from now on. No surprises ever again, and I want you to feel free to ask me anything at any time." It was such a small gesture in some ways. 1 page of numbers on a Sunday afternoon, but I understood it for what it truly was. An apology written in the only language my son and I had ever really needed between us. Plain honesty laid out where I could read every line myself. Garrett and Bailey have grown up faster than I would have liked because of all this, in the particular way children sometimes do when they witness the adults around them fail, and then slowly work to repair what was broken. Garrett has told me more than once that watching his grandmother refuse to be pushed around, refuse to be quietly erased or dismissed as confused, taught him something about what it looks like to stand up for yourself without becoming cruel in the process. He is applying to study finance in college now, which makes me laugh sometimes, wondering if some small part of that choice traces back to watching his grandmother outmaneuver a bank fraud at 72 years old with nothing but patience and a legal pad, which was eventually sold at a loss to cover what portion of the debt could be recovered. He calls me every Sunday now, not because he has to, but because he told me once, quietly over the phone, that almost losing my house taught him something about what actually matters that he was too busy and too trusting to see before. He apologizes to me sometimes, even now, for not asking harder questions, for not protecting me from a situation he did not fully understand was happening under his own roof. And I tell him every time that he does not owe me an apology for another person's crime, only for the small ways his silence made space for it, and that we are square as long as he keeps showing up the way he has been. There was one more piece of this story I have not told you yet, and I saved it for near the end because it is, in its own way, the piece that brought me the most peace. About 6 months after everything settled, the bank's internal investigation into Curtis Beaumont, the loan officer who had pushed the original application through without properly scrutinizing the collateral documents, finally concluded. Thomas told me the bank had found a pattern, not just with our loan, but with at least 4 other loans over the previous 2 years, where corners had been cut in similar ways, always with Beaumont as the approving officer, always with the same rushed notarization process, and always, disturbingly, involving older family members, listed as secondary, guarantors who later claimed they had not fully understood what they signed. I was not the only grandmother this had happened to. There were at least 3 others, one of them a 78-year-old widower too. Counties over who had very nearly lost his farm the same way I had very nearly lost my house. Learning that I was not alone did something to me that I did not expect. Part of me had spent months quietly wondering if I had simply been foolish. If a smarter, sharper woman would have caught what was happening before it went this far. But sitting with Thomas in his office, looking at a pattern that stretched across 4 different families and 2 different counties, I understood that this was never really about my intelligence or my carefulness. This was about a system, a young loan officer under pressure to close deals, a notary willing to cut corners, and family members like Renee who had learned, whether from their own upbringing or simply from watching how easy it was to get away with, that the fastest path to money was through the people who loved them enough not to ask hard questions. I gave a statement to the state banking regulators investigating Beaumont's conduct, and Thomas told me later that my statement, combined with the others, was part of what led to Beaumont losing his banking license permanently rather than simply being quietly let go to work at another branch, somewhere else, which is so often how these things end when nobody is willing to speak up. I started something after that, small at first, nothing formal, just conversations with the other women at my church, at my grocery store, at the pharmacy counter where I pick up my prescriptions every month. I started telling them gently, in ordinary conversation, to always ask for a copy of anything they sign, to never sign a stack of papers quickly as a favor to anyone, no matter how much they loved that person, to call their bank directly if anyone, family included, ever told them their signature was needed for something they did not fully understand. Dolores started calling it my little campaign. Half joking, but I noticed over the following year that at least 2 other women at my church came to me separately, quietly, to tell me that something I had said in passing had made them stop and actually read a document they had almost signed without looking, one of them catching an actual attempt by a distant relative to add himself to her deed, under the guise of helping her with estate planning. I do not say this to make myself sound like some kind of hero. I say it because I believe with my whole heart that the way we protect grandmothers like me is not just through lawyers and banks and courtrooms, though those matter enormously. It is through women talking to each other, plainly, without shame, about the ways this kind of thing happens, so that fewer of us have to learn it the hard way that I did. My house still stands. The floors my husband laid with his own. Hands are still under my feet every single morning. When I walk to my kitchen to make coffee, my name is clean again, cleared from that loan, cleared from any record of wrongdoing, restored fully through Thomas's careful, patient work over those difficult months, and I am, if anything, more careful now than I have ever been in my life, not colder, not harder in the way that closes a person off from love, but wiser in the particular way that only comes from learning, at 72 years old, that love and trust are not actually the same thing, and that a grandmother's love for her family should never again come with a blank folder and an unread signature line. People sometimes ask me or write to me after hearing stories like this one, whether I regret ever letting Renee back into my kitchen that rainy Thursday evening, whether forgiveness makes a woman soft in a world that clearly does not deserve softness. I tell them what I have come to believe deeply at this point in my life, which is that softness and strength were never actually opposites to begin with, no matter how many old stories try to convince us otherwise. It took more strength for me to sit across from the woman who had forged my signature and hear her out than it would have taken to simply slam the door in her face and feel righteous about it for the rest of my days. Slamming the door would have been easy. Sitting with the discomfort of a complicated, unfinished relationship, holding both the harm she caused and the humanity underneath it at the same time. That was the harder work, and I believe it was the right work, even on the days it did not feel especially rewarding. I also think often about what it means to be 72 years old in a world that too often assumes women my age are meant to fade quietly into the background of our own families, grateful for whatever attention and inclusion we are given, careful never to make waves, never to ask too many questions, never to inconvenience anyone with our doubts or our vigilance. I refused that role the moment I picked up the phone with Thomas and asked him to help me find the truth. And I want every woman watching this who is my age or approaching it, or who has a mother or grandmother approaching it, to understand something clearly. Age does not entitle anyone in your family to your signature without explanation. Love does not obligate you to sign anything you have not read completely, twice, in full daylight, with your glasses on and your questions asked out loud. The moment someone rushes you through paperwork, folder already open, pen already in your hand, pointing quickly at lines while telling you not to worry about the details, that is not family looking out for you. That is, at best, carelessness, and at worst, exactly what happened to me. I think about that spring afternoon sometimes, the tulips on my table, Renee's hand steadying the folder while mine shook from arthritis, and I think about how close I came to losing everything simply because I loved someone enough to trust her without question. I do not regret that love. I refuse to let this experience turn me into a woman who loves conditionally, who reads every gesture of kindness from my family as a potential trap. But I have learned, in the hardest way a woman can learn something at my age, that love and vigilance are not opposites. You can open your heart and still read every single word on every single page before you sign it. You can forgive someone completely and still never hand them the folder again. That is not bitterness. That is simply what surviving looks like when you are 72 years old and you have already given this family everything else you have. I want to leave you with one final thought before I close tonight. Something Thomas said to me on the last day we sat together, finalizing all the paperwork that finally cleared my name completely from every trace of that loan. He told me that in all his years practicing law, the cases that stayed with him longest were never the ones involving strangers. Contracts between businesses, disputes between people who owed each other nothing but money. The cases that stayed with him were always the family cases, the ones where the betrayal came wrapped in a hug, delivered with a kiss on the cheek, carried in on a bouquet of flowers, because those are the wounds that cut deepest and heal slowest, precisely because the person who caused them is still sitting across the table from you at every holiday for the rest of your life. He told me that what I had done, choosing accountability without choosing total destruction, holding a line firm enough to protect myself while leaving a door open, narrow enough for repair, was, in his professional opinion, the hardest and rarest outcome he had ever seen a client achieve. I do not know if that is entirely true, but I have chosen to believe it, because it gives meaning to everything that happened. Every sleepless night, every quiet phone call to Thomas's office, every moment I sat across from a woman I once trusted completely and made myself hold steady instead of collapsing into either forgiveness too quickly or hatred too permanently. If you have made it this far with me tonight, I want to thank you, genuinely, from the bottom of my heart, because stories like mine do not get told enough. And grandmothers, like me, do not always have someone willing to sit and listen all the way to the end. So many older women go through exactly what I went through, quietly, alone, too embarrassed or too heartbroken to tell anyone that their own family took advantage of them, and I refused to be embarrassed about something that was never my fault to begin with. I was not foolish for trusting my daughter-in-law. I was simply a grandmother who loved her family, and love should never be the thing that gets punished in a story like this. So, tell me, one more time before we go, where are you watching from tonight? Type your city in the comments below. I truly do read every single one, and it means more to me than you probably know to see how far this story has traveled. How many kitchens and living rooms and phone screens across this country, and beyond it my voice has somehow found its way into. And if you love your grandmother, if you have a grandmother in your life who has ever given more than she received, who has ever trusted more than she should have and paid a painful price for it, do me a favor tonight. Hit that like button for her. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next story. Because there will be more. There are always more. Families are complicated, and grandmothers like me have seen it all. And share this video with a friend who needs to hear tonight that it is never too late. Not at 50, not at 60, not even at 72 years old, to stand up, gather your facts, and take your life back. Until next time, I am Iris Calloway, and this has been my story.